In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who'll tell you, nobody warns you about the sound. Everyone talks about the light, the golden radiance, the way your knees give out and you weep for reasons you can't name. Nobody mentions the sound. Because it isn't one. It's the absence of every sound you've ever known. A frequency older than language, older than the first breath on the first world. The first time he heard it, he forgot his own name. He forgot his mother's name. He forgot what fear was. And that forgetting was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to him. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Lenko Osse, born on Viranthos, a world of pressed metal and grease-colored skies that had been alone among the stars for longer than anyone could remember. He sealed transit rails 80 meters underground, 12-hour shifts, a small life that belonged to him. Then the sky split open, the ships came down, and the Imperium arrived to bring his world into compliance, led, in person, by the Emperor of Mankind himself. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. They never tell you about the sound. Everyone talks about the light, the golden radiance, the way your knees give out and your vision swims, and you feel this need to weep for no reason you can name. Nobody mentions the sound. Because it isn't a sound, not really. It's the absence of every sound you've ever known, replaced by something that vibrates in the marrow of your bones, in the fluid behind your eyes, in the wet meat of your brain. A frequency that was there before language, before thought, before the first lung drew the first breath on the first world. The first time I heard it, I forgot my own name. I forgot the name of my mother. I forgot what fear was, and that forgetting was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Lenko Osse, and I was born on Viranthos. Not that you'd know the name, nobody does, unless they've been there, and nobody goes there unless they have to. It's a world of pressed metal and recycled air, where the sky is the color of old grease, and the rain leaves stains on your skin that take days to scrub out. I was a rail sealer. That's what I did before the Imperium found us. I welded transit rail joints in the sub-level freight network, 80 meters below the surface, where the heat from the planetary core leaked through the rock and made the air taste like hot copper. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, year after year, kneeling in access tunnels so tight I couldn't straighten my back. Running a fusion lance along seams that had to be perfect, because if a rail joint cracked under a loaded ore hauler at speed, the derailment would kill everyone in the tunnel section. I was 23 years old when the sky split open and the ships came down. Viranthos had been alone for a long time, since before anyone could remember. The old histories said we'd been part of something bigger once, a human federation that spanned the stars. But that was ancient myth, the kind of story old men told in the refectories during meal breaks. Our world had its own government, its own laws, its own small miseries and smaller joys. We weren't perfect. The industrial clans ran everything. The air was filthy. The work was dangerous. And if you were born in the sub-levels, you died in the sub-levels. But we were ours. We belonged to ourselves. The compliance action took 9 days. That's what the records said, at least. 9 days. That's what they called it, and that's what they wrote down. Compliance. As if we'd been out of line. As if by existing independently, we'd committed some kind of administrative violation that needed correcting. The ships that descended through our polluted clouds were vast beyond anything we had words for. I remember standing in the freight yard outside Shaft 12, my welding visor pushed up on my forehead, watching a vessel that must have been 3 kilometers long descend through the haze, its engines turning the air into a furnace wind that knocked people off their feet half a city away. The noise was extraordinary. A sustained rolling thunder that went on, shaking the transit rails beneath my boots, rattling tools off their hooks, making my teeth ache in my skull. Our planetary defense forces fought. Of course they did. They were soldiers, and soldiers fight when something descends from the sky with weapons charged. The organized resistance on the surface lasted less than 3 days. The invaders weren't just better equipped. They were operating on a completely different level of warfare. Our anti-air batteries, the pride of the Viranthos defense militia, were disabled by electronic warfare systems that fried their targeting cogitators before they could lock on. Our armored companies were met by vehicles that shrugged off direct hits from battle cannons. And then on the 3rd day, they deployed the giants. I didn't see them fight. I was underground when the final assault happened, huddled in a freight tunnel with 40 other workers, while the ceiling shook and dust rained down and the sound of explosions filtered through 8 levels of rock and metal. But I saw the aftermath. When we finally crawled out, blinking in the gray light, the defensive positions along the threshold were just gone. Not destroyed, not ruined, erased. The Ferrocrete bunkers that had guarded the main transit hub for as long as anyone could remember had been reduced to gravel, and standing in the wreckage, casual as men waiting for a tram, were figures in armor that hurt to look at. Not because of any radiance, because they were wrong. Too big, too still. Their proportions were human but scaled up to a point where the eye rejected them. They didn't move like men. They moved like industrial machinery that had been given the shape of men as an afterthought. Space Marines. I learned the word later. At the time, they were just the giants that broke our world in 3 days and called it liberation. The compliance brought iterators, bureaucrats, census takers, new laws, new symbols. The Aquila went up on every public building within a week, its double-headed eagles staring down at us from walls where our own emblems had hung for centuries. And with all of it came the tithe. Every world brought into compliance owed a debt, they said. Resources, materials, and people. The Imperial Army needed bodies, and Viranthos had bodies to spare. I was among the first taken, not because I volunteered. Nobody from the sub-levels volunteered. We were selected, designated, names on a list that some administrator with a quill and a data slate had compiled based on age, health metrics, and expendability. I was 23, healthy enough, and a rail sealer's absence wouldn't shut down the freight network. So I was expendable. The same logic that had governed my entire life, the logic of industrial efficiency, now applied to my death. I was a component being reassigned from one machine to another. They shipped us off-world in bulk transports that smelled of disinfectant and sweat and fear. 2,000 of us from Viranthos, packed into a converted freight hauler, sleeping in racks stacked 4 high. We were given uniforms that didn't fit, boots that rubbed blisters inside the first hour, and lost guns that none of us knew how to use. The training happened in transit, conducted by drill masters who had been breaking recruits since before most of us were born. They didn't care about our names. They cared about whether we could march in formation, fire on command, and die in the right direction. The 44th Viranthos Infantry Cohort. That was our designation. 1,400 men and women sorted into companies, platoons, and squads by the same impersonal arithmetic that had sorted us out of our lives. I was assigned to 3rd Company, 2nd Platoon, Squad 9. My squad leader was a woman named Palav Gear, who had been a boiler tender in one of the upper-level manufactoria. She was 10 years older than me, had hands like shovels, and possessed the particular calm of someone who had spent their entire working life around pressurized systems that could kill everyone in the room if mishandled. She was a good squad leader. She kept us alive for longer than most. Our first deployment was on a world called Kesavar. I don't remember much about the compliance briefing. Something about Xenos infestation, greenskins. The Astartes had already broken the main orc settlements, and we were deployed to what the officers called mopping up operations. I learned very quickly what mopping up meant. It meant walking through the aftermath of what the giants had done and killing whatever they'd left behind. Wounded orcs, mostly. Feral ones. Disorganized, scattered, but still individually capable of tearing a human being in half. The first orc I killed was lying in a drainage ditch with most of its left side caved in. It still managed to swing at me with a cleaver made from a vehicle panel before I put 3 last rounds through its skull. The third round was unnecessary. The first 2 had already killed it. I fired the third because my hands wouldn't stop squeezing the trigger. Palav found me afterwards, sitting on a chunk of masonry, staring at the dead orc. She didn't say anything. She just handed me a ration bar and stood there until I ate it. And then she said, "Come on," and I got up and followed her. And that was the end of my first kill. There was no ceremony, no moment of reckoning. I'd killed something that was trying to kill me, and now there was more killing to do, and the war didn't pause so that I could process my feelings about it. That was perhaps the most important lesson of my early service. The war didn't care what you felt. It only cared what you did. Kesavar took 4 months. 4 months of trudging through Xenos-ravaged terrain, clearing settlement after settlement, burning orc fungal colonies with flamers so they wouldn't regrow. The Astartes were long gone by then, moved on to the next real fight, leaving the ugly, tedious, dangerous work to us. This, I came to understand, was the true role of the Imperial Army. We weren't the blade. We were the hand that cleaned the blade after the cutting was done. We held ground. We patrolled. We garrisoned. We died in 1s and 2s to booby traps and ambushes and accidents, and nobody outside our own cohort noticed or cared, because the greater war had moved on and we were just the residue. I collected my first stone on Kesavar, a smooth black pebble from the bank of a river that ran through a clearing the orcs hadn't reached. I don't know why I picked it up. Something about its weight, its coolness. A solid, real thing from a real place that I could hold in my hand and know was mine. I started doing it on every world after that. A fragment of stone, a piece of metal, a shard of glass. Small things that fit in a belt pouch. Souvenirs of places I'd been, proof that those places existed outside the sameness of transit holds and deployment zones and killing grounds. The other soldiers thought it was odd. I didn't explain it. Some things don't need explaining. After Kesavar came Dreneth. After Dreneth came Yulgor. After Yulgor came Festa III, where we lost our first platoon leader to a sniper, and Palav took a piece of shrapnel in the shoulder that the Medicae pulled out with pliers while she sat on an ammunition crate and swore steadily in Viranthan dialect. After Festa III came Orbeth Secundus, a gray dustball with 1 city and 3 million people who didn't want imperial rule. No Xenos, no mutation. Just a human settlement that had voted, through whatever governing system they'd maintained through the Age of Strife, to reject compliance. They fought like desperate men because that's what they were. And that was harder than the orcs. The orcs were alien, monstrous. Easy to kill without thinking about what you were doing. The Orbith defenders were men and women with families, and reasons and faces that looked like your cousin or your neighbor or the person who'd served you recalf that morning. We took the city in 12 days. On the 9th day, during a push through their administrative quarter, I cleared a room and found a man sitting behind a desk. A bureaucrat, gray-haired, thin, wearing the kind of formal clothing that a person puts on when they've decided that their last day should look like every other day. He had no weapon. He had a pen. He was writing something, a letter, I think, though I never read it. And when I kicked the door in, he looked up at me with an expression that wasn't fear. It was disappointment. The quiet, tired disappointment of a man who had expected better and received exactly what he'd feared. I didn't shoot him. He wasn't a threat. I detained him, tagged him for processing, and moved on. But his face stayed with me. It settled into a seam in my memory the way grit settles into a rail joint, invisible but abrasive, wearing at the surface every time the mechanism moved. He was the first person I'd conquered who made me feel like the villain. I didn't examine that feeling. I'd been a rail sealer. I understood what it meant to do a job you didn't choose, in conditions you didn't like for reasons that weren't yours. The Imperial army wasn't so different from the freight tunnels of Viaranthos. You kept your head down, did your work, and tried not to get killed by the machinery. 2 years in, our cohort was folded into the 831st Expeditionary Fleet. This was a promotion, in theory. Expeditionary fleets operated at the leading edge of the Great Crusade, pushing into uncharted space, bringing new worlds into compliance. In practice, it meant we were further from home, further from resupply, and closer to the kinds of enemies that actually required more than mopping up. The 831st was a mid-size fleet built around the battle barge Relentless Advance and supported by a dozen cruisers, various escort squadrons, and enough troop transports to carry 40,000 Imperial Army soldiers alongside their armor, artillery, and support elements. Its hardened core was a cohort of Solar Auxilia, the Xetom Herald, void-born professionals who made the rest of us look like the conscripted laborers we were. We rarely saw Astartes at all in those years. When a Legion detachment did pass through the fleet on its way to some greater fight, they came, they killed, they left, and we cleaned up after them. Space Marines were Space Marines. The specific heraldry on their pauldrons didn't change that equation. The expeditionary campaigns were different from the garrison work we'd done before. Faster, more violent, more confusing. We'd translate into a system. The Astartes would make their initial assessment, and then the compliance action would begin. Sometimes it was quick, a show of force, a few orbital strikes, a surrender. Sometimes it wasn't. On Thren Septimus, we fought for 8 months against a Xenos species that burrowed through solid rock like fish through water, emerging beneath our positions to drag soldiers underground. We lost 300 people on Thren Septimus. I lost Igor Stranev, who'd been in my squad since Kesavar, and who played the most annoying card game ever invented during every waking hour he wasn't on duty. A burrower took him, pulled him down through the floor of his own foxhole. We heard him screaming for about 4 seconds before the sound cut off. I collected a piece of quartz from Thren Septimus, white, with veins of iron running through it. I keep it next to the black pebble from Kesavar. After 3 years in the 831st, I'd fought on 11 worlds. I'd been wounded twice, nothing serious. Lass burns that the Medicais patched and sent me back. I'd been promoted to corporal, not because of any particular talent, but because enough people above me had died to create the vacancy. Palav was a sergeant now, running second platoon with the same boiler-tender steadiness she'd always had. We'd lost over a third of our original cohort and been reinforced with drafts from other worlds, people who spoke different languages and came from different cultures and had nothing in common with us except the uniform and the gun. This was the Great Crusade. This was the grand project of humanity's reunification, the Emperor's dream of a species united under one banner, reaching for the stars. From the perspective of official histories and remembrancers' accounts, it was an age of wonder. From the perspective of a corporal in the Imperial Army, it was an endless succession of transits and deployments and firefights, punctuated by periods of crushing boredom and sustained by ration bars that all tasted the same regardless of what the wrapper claimed. I didn't think about the grand scale of it. Grand scale was for the generals and the Astartes and the distant golden figure of the Emperor, whom I'd never seen and honestly never expected to see. He was an idea, a name on a banner, a face on a coin I'd never held, as real to me as the god kings of old Viranthos, which is to say, not real at all. That was about to change. It was the middle of our fourth year with the 831st when the orders came down. Not the usual deployment briefing, not the standard compliance package with its sterile summaries of target worlds and expected resistance levels. This was different. Fleet-wide assembly. Every officer above the rank of lieutenant summoned to the relentless advance for a briefing conducted by a figure none of us had ever seen before. I caught a glimpse of him through the viewport of the officer's shuttle as it docked. A figure in golden armor that made the Astartes look underdressed. Even through the viewport, even at that distance, he had a presence that pressed against the glass like heat. A custodian, someone whispered. One of the Emperor's personal guard. His helm was off, and for a fraction of a second, I saw his face, severe and sharp, the face of a weapon given flesh. I didn't know his name. I didn't know that I'd see that face again. But the eye remembers what the mind hasn't yet learned to fear. The briefing lasted 6 hours. We weren't told what was discussed. Enlisted men never are. But when Captain Broya Kest came back to our barracks section, she had a look on her face that I'd never seen before. Not fear, not excitement. Something between the two. Something that didn't have a word. She gathered the NCOs in the company command post and told us, in a voice that was almost steady, that the 831st Expeditionary Fleet had been assigned to a combined task force for a major compliance action on a world called Aetharna. She told us that the resistance was expected to be significant. She told us that we would be fighting alongside the Astartes, elements drawn from 2 full legions. And then she told us who would be leading the assault. The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of an intake of breath that nobody lets out. The quiet of a word being spoken that changes everything that comes after it. The Emperor of mankind was coming. He was coming, and we were going to fight beside him. I should tell you what the days after that announcement were like, because the reality of it didn't land all at once. It seeped in. You'd be cleaning your last gun, running the cloth down the barrel, the way you'd done 1,000 times. And suddenly the thought would surface. The Emperor. Not a statue on a wall, not a name in a briefing. The actual living being who had unified Terra, who had built the Imperium, who had created the Space Marines and walked among the stars for centuries before any of us were born. That being was going to be in the same theater of operations as Corporal Lenko Osse, rail sealer from the sub-levels of Viranthos. The absurdity of it would hit you and you'd stop what you were doing and just sit there, cloth in hand, last barrel half polished, while the idea rattled around inside your skull, looking for something to attach to and finding nothing. Because there was nothing in your experience that prepared you for this. The fleet gathered over the following weeks. It was the largest concentration of military force I'd ever seen, and I say that as someone who'd spent years watching the Imperial war machine operate. Ships arrived from multiple sectors. Troop transports by the dozen, their hulls scarred from 100 warp transits. Cruisers with weapons batteries that could level continents. And then, for the first time in my service, the Astartes vessels, sleek and predatory, arriving in precise formation like predators closing on wounded prey. The Xitom Herald and the rest of our mortal cohorts were suddenly a minor presence. 2 full companies of the Lunar Wolves arrived aboard a strike cruiser that dwarfed the relentless advance. Behind them came elements of the Emperor's Children, the Third Legion, in vessels so ornately decorated that they looked more like pleasure barges than warships. I learned later that the ornamentation was deliberate, a reflection of the Legion's pursuit of perfection in all things, including the aesthetics of war. At the time, I just thought they were vain. The task force assembled in a system 3 warp jumps from Aetharna. A dead system, no habitable worlds, just a handful of rocky planets orbiting a dim star. The fleet hung in the void like a city suspended in darkness, and for 4 days we waited while the strategists and the Astartes, and whatever other powers directed the Great Crusade, finalized their plans. During the wait, we trained, harder than we'd ever trained before. The drill masters pushed us through combined arms exercises until our legs gave out, then made us do it again. We practiced urban assault, which told us something about the target. We practiced fighting in close quarters, which told us something about the expected resistance. And we practiced something new, operating in proximity to Astartes at combat speed, which meant learning to stay out of the way of beings that moved faster than anything that size had a right to move, and didn't particularly care if you were standing where they needed to be. That training was where I first interacted with the Lunar Wolves. Not spoke to, interacted with. There's a difference. Speaking implies a conversation between peers. What happened was that a Lunar Wolf sergeant walked into our training section, looked at us the way a man looks at furniture he's considering rearranging, and told us in a voice that sounded like gravel being fed through a machine press that we would be operating in close support during the assault on Aetharna's primary citadel, and that if any of us deviated from our assigned lanes of advance, his brothers would not stop to check whether the body under their boots was friendly or hostile before stepping on it. He wasn't being cruel. I understood that even then. He was being precise. To an Astartes, a mortal soldier occupied a particular place in the tactical equation, the same way a sandbag or a piece of terrain did. We were cover, we were suppressive fire. We were bodies that could absorb enemy ammunition that might otherwise hit something valuable. The sergeant wasn't threatening us. He was describing the laws of physics as they applied to his combat environment. And in that environment, we were obstacles to be navigated, not allies to be coordinated with. Pallav took it better than most. She gathered the squad after the briefing and said, in her flat, practical way, that she'd spent 20 years working around machinery that could crush her without noticing, and the only rule that mattered was, don't be where the machinery is going to be. The Astartes were the machinery. We were the operators. Stay clear, stay useful, stay alive. I've kept that advice with me through everything that came after. It's the best military counsel I've ever received, and it came from a woman who'd never held a weapon before the day they put Ilas gun in her hands. The briefings on Aetharna itself were delivered by a tactical officer from the Lunar Wolves staff. He was mortal, technically, an ordinary human who served in the Legion's Strategic Planning Corps, but he had the clipped, efficient manner of someone who'd been around Astartes long enough to absorb their directness. Aetharna, he told us, was a human-settled world, not Xenos, not a mutant enclave, not a feral outpost. A developed, populated, technologically sophisticated human civilization that had survived the age of strife intact and had, in the centuries since, built something remarkable. The Aetharnate Concordance, they called themselves. A federation of city-states spanning the planet's 3 major continents, united by a shared system of governance that blended democratic council rule with a technocratic elite. They had void-capable ships, though they hadn't colonized beyond their own system. They had energy weapons that were, according to the briefing officer, broadly comparable to Imperial last technology, but based on a different design philosophy that made them incompatible with Imperial supply lines. They had a standing military of approximately 2 million professional soldiers equipped with powered armor, combat vehicles, and atmospheric fighter craft. They had orbital defense platforms. And they had said no. That was the core of it. The Imperium had sent iterators, diplomats, representatives of the imperial truth, carrying the Emperor's message of unity and human solidarity. The Aetharnate had listened, they had considered, and they had refused. They didn't want to join. They didn't recognize the authority of a distant emperor they'd never heard of to dictate the terms of their civilization's future. They weren't aggressive about it. They didn't threaten. They simply said, "No, thank you, we're fine as we are," and closed the door. The Imperium doesn't accept no? I remember sitting in that briefing, looking at the hololithic display showing Aetharna's surface, its cities marked in blue light, its military installations in red. A beautiful world from what the images showed. Green and blue and white, the colors of a planet that had been cared for, maintained, kept alive through the long night by people who understood that their world was all they had. I remember thinking that it looked like the kind of place people back on Viranthos dreamed about. The kind of world where the sky was actually a color you'd want to see. And I remember the briefing officer saying, in his clipped, Astartes-adjacent voice, that the Emperor was coming personally because the Aetharnate possessed something of immense strategic value. He didn't specify what. He didn't need to. The implication was clear enough. This wasn't a standard compliance action. This was a retrieval operation dressed up as a liberation, and the entire military force being assembled, the thousands of Astartes, the tens of thousands of army soldiers, the warships and the war machines, all of it existed to take one thing from a world that didn't want to give it up. The name of the thing was never spoken in any briefing I attended. I heard rumors, of course. Soldiers talk. Someone said it was a weapon, a relic from the dark age of technology, something that could tear holes in the fabric of space. Someone else said it was a vault of knowledge, scientific records from before the age of strife that contained information the Emperor needed for some secret project. A third rumor claimed it was a person, a psyker of extraordinary power whom the Emperor wanted to add to his collection. I don't know which, if any, was true. I know only that the Emperor of mankind was willing to lead an army to this world in person, and that whatever he wanted from Aetharna was important enough to justify the deaths of everyone who stood between him and it. We had 3 days before the fleet departed for Aetharna. 3 days of final preparations, equipment checks, ammunition distribution, all the mechanical rituals of an army preparing for war. During those 3 days, a ship arrived in system that made every other vessel look like a rowboat beside a cathedral. I was on the observation deck of our transport when it translated from the warp. I watched it emerge from nothing, from that terrible momentary tear in reality that accompanied every warp translation, a wound in space that leaked colors that shouldn't exist and sounds that reached you through the hull plating like whispers in a language you almost understood. The ship that came through was gold. Not painted gold, not decorated in gold. It was as if the concept of gold had been given physical form and shaped into a vessel of war. The Bucephalus, someone said, the Emperor's flagship, one of the largest warships ever constructed, a vessel that had been at the forefront of the Great Crusade since its earliest days, that had carried the master of mankind from one end of the galaxy to the other. I couldn't see its full extent, not from a single vantage point. It filled the viewport the way a mountain fills a valley, and it kept filling it, more and more of it sliding into real space, until the mind simply gave up trying to process its scale and settled for awe. I stood there for a long time after it had fully arrived. The observation deck was crowded. Every off-duty soldier on the transport had come to see. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. We were looking at a ship that carried a being who had unified Terra and reached for the stars, who had created warriors that made mortal men look like children, who had bent the very laws of nature to his will. Somewhere aboard that golden vessel, behind walls of adamantium and void shields and the most lethal bodyguards ever created, the Emperor of mankind existed, breathed, thought. For the first time since I'd been dragged out of my life on Viranthos and handed a gun, I felt something that might have been purpose. Not because I believed in the Great Crusade, not because I'd been persuaded by the Iterator's arguments about human unity and the imperial truth, but because there's something in every human being, something buried deep in the architecture of the species, that responds to the proximity of something greater than itself. A resonance, an acknowledgement that you are in the presence of the extraordinary, and that simply being near it changes the meaning of your own small existence. I didn't worship the Emperor, not then, but I felt for the first time the pull that would eventually become worship in those who lacked the vocabulary to describe it any other way. The fleet departed 2 days later, 412 ships burning through the warp toward a world that wanted nothing to do with us, carrying an army that would crush it regardless, led by a being whose will was the closest thing to a law of physics that human civilization had ever produced. The warp transit took 11 days. 11 days in that howling knot space, locked in our barracks, feeling the Geller field hum through the hull like a living thing straining against pressure. Warp transit is never pleasant. This one was worse than most. The presence of the Emperor's ship seemed to agitate the Imperium itself, as if the warp knew what was passing through it and resented the intrusion. Soldiers reported nightmares. Vivid, choking nightmares of drowning in gold, of burning in light that gave no warmth, of voices speaking words that dissolved meaning. I had them too. I dreamed I was back in the freight tunnels of Viranthos, running my fusion lance along a rail seam, but the seam wouldn't close. No matter how much heat I applied, the metal refused to fuse, and through the gap I could see light. Golden light, blinding, terrible light that was trying to push through the crack and fill the tunnel and fill me and fill everything. I woke up soaked in sweat, my hands cramping as if I'd been gripping something for hours. The transit ended, and we translated into the Aetharna system. What greeted us was not what I expected. The orbital defense platforms were there, yes, just as the briefing had described. But they were silent. Their weapons were powered down. Their running lights blinked steadily in the void, the universal signal of a system in standby mode. The Aethernet knew we were coming. They knew what we brought, and they had chosen, in what I can only describe as either supreme courage or supreme foolishness, not to fire the first shot. For 3 days, there was communication between the fleet and the planet. I don't know what was said. We were told nothing. We sat in our barracks, armor on, weapons checked, ready to deploy at any moment, living in that particular limbo that soldiers know intimately, the purgatory between the order to prepare and the order to go. During those 3 days, I watched the planet through a porthole in the troop bay. Aetharna was everything the briefing images had promised, a jewel of a world, blue oceans, green continents, white cloud patterns that swirled with the elegant complexity of a living weather system, cities visible as faint geometric patterns on the night side, neat and ordered, lit with a warm amber glow that suggested energy abundance and careful urban planning. I collected nothing from Aetharna's orbit. There was nothing to collect, but I pressed my hand against the porthole and felt the cold of the void seeping through the glass. And I looked at a world that was about to die and didn't know it yet. The machinery was already in motion. The seam was already marked. All that remained was the welding. On the 4th day, the order came. The Aetharnate had maintained their refusal. Compliance would be achieved by force. We loaded into our landing craft and waited in the launch bays, packed shoulder to shoulder, breathing recycled air that tasted of fear and gun oil. The assault would begin with an orbital bombardment of the defense platforms, followed by atmospheric insertion of the Astartes spearheads, followed by the main army landing. Our objective was the capital city, a place called Luminar, a city of 6 million people who had woken up that morning as citizens of a sovereign world and who would go to sleep that night, if they went to sleep at all, as subjects of the Imperium of man. The bombardment began. We felt it through the hull, deep rhythmic vibrations, the pulse of macro cannons firing in sequence. Through the launch bay's external feeds, we could see the flashes. The defense platforms, those silent, patient sentinels, came alive in their final moments, returning fire with everything they had, filling the void with beams of coherent light that splashed against the fleet's void shields like rain against a window. It was brave. It was utterly futile. One by one, the platforms died. The assault on Aetharna had begun. And somewhere above us, aboard that golden ship, the Emperor watched. The landing was violent. Not in the way that combat is violent, which is chaotic and unpredictable and full of noise. This was the controlled violence of machinery performing its function, the lurching deceleration of our Devourer-class lander as it punched through Aetharna's atmosphere, the hull screaming, the heat bleeding through the bulkheads. The soldiers inside braced in their harnesses like components in a machine being stress-tested to failure. I could hear las fire pinging off the outer hull as the atmospheric fighters engaged our craft. Small caliber. Not enough to bring us down, but enough to remind us that the people below intended to fight. We hit ground hard, the ramp dropped, and a third company poured out into a landscape that had, until approximately 20 minutes ago, been a suburb. It was still recognizable as one, if you squinted. The buildings were low, clean-lined structures made from some white, composite material that Viranthos didn't have a name for. Residential blocks from the look of them. They had gardens. Actual gardens with plants in them, green and flowering, maintained by people who had the time and the resources and the inclination to grow things that served no industrial purpose. The orbital bombardment hadn't targeted this district directly, but the shock waves from nearby strikes had done enough. Windows blown in, roof lines sagging, that white composite cracked and stained with soot. And the gardens were on fire, which seemed like a small cruelty among larger ones. But it's the detail I remember. We advanced through the suburb in standard urban formation, 2 squads forward, 1 squad covering, leapfrogging through the residential blocks toward the city's inner ring where the military resistance was concentrated. The Aetharnate soldiers fought well. Their powered armor was lighter than ours, more elegant, built for mobility rather than protection. But they knew their city and they used it. Fighting positions in upper-story windows, kill zones at intersections, coordinated fallbacks that drew us into crossfires before dissolving and reforming 2 blocks further in. They weren't amateurs. These were professional soldiers defending their home, and they made us pay for every meter. We lost Denna Murta in the first hour. A last bolt through the throat, clean and precise, fired by someone we never saw. She went down mid-stride, one hand reaching for her neck, and by the time Palav reached her, she was gone. Denna had been with us since Kesavar. She'd been quiet, competent, the kind of soldier you relied on, because she always did exactly what was needed without being told. I didn't mourn her in the moment. The moment didn't allow for it. I noted her absence the way you note a broken tool with a professional assessment of how it affected the job, and I kept moving. The Astartes had deployed ahead of us. The Luna Wolves had dropped directly into the city's core, right on top of the government district, in a spearhead insertion designed to decapitate the Aetharnate command structure. The Emperor's children had landed to our east, advancing through the industrial zones that ringed the city. The Xetum Herald had been committed to the south, spearheading the mortal advance where no legion could be spared. Our role was to follow the Luna Wolves' wake, secure the ground they'd taken, suppress resistance in the cleared sectors, and prevent the Aetharnate from closing the gaps behind the Astartes' advance. It was during this advance that I first felt it. The sound that isn't a sound. We were pushing through a park, or what had been a park before the fighting reached it. Trees splintered by last fire, a pond choked with debris, pathways cracked and heaved by the shock waves of nearby detonations. The fighting had moved ahead of us, the roar of bolters and the sharper crack of Aetharnate energy weapons echoing off the surrounding buildings. I was crouched behind a toppled statue, some figure in robes holding a scroll, very civilized, very un-imperial, reloading my last gun, when the world went still. Not quiet. Still. There's a difference. Quiet is the absence of noise. Stillness is the absence of everything except one thing. And that one thing was the frequency. It rose from nowhere, from everywhere, from inside my own chest. A vibration that bypassed my ears entirely and went straight into the deep structures of my brain. The parts that govern balance and spatial awareness and the instinctive recognition of self. For a moment, I didn't know where my body ended and the air began. For a moment, I wasn't Lenko Osse. I was a receiver, an antenna, tuned to a signal that had been broadcasting since before my species crawled out of the oceans of its birth world. Palav grabbed my arm. Her face was white. Her pupils were the size of pinheads. She was feeling it too. Everyone was. Up and down the line, soldiers had stopped moving. Some were on their knees. One man in 3rd Squad was weeping, tears running down his face. His expression not sad, but overwhelmed, like someone trying to drink from a waterfall. "He's here," Palav said. She didn't need to specify who. The Emperor of Mankind set foot on Aetharna at the 14th hour of the first day. I know this because I looked at my chrono immediately after, and the time stamped itself into my memory with the same permanence as the moment of my birth, if I could remember it. He descended from orbit in a transport that I never saw, landing somewhere near the government district where the Luna Wolves had established their beachhead. I was 2 kilometers from the landing site. 2 kilometers, and His presence hit me like a wall. Let me describe what it feels like, because the official accounts don't. The official accounts talk about radiance and majesty and the golden light of humanity's salvation. The official accounts are written by people who weren't there, or by remembrancers who experienced it through the cushion of artistic distance and translated it into language that could survive publication. What I felt was not radiance. What I felt was pressure, a psychic pressure that compressed every thought I'd ever had into a single, white-hot point of awareness, and then expanded it outward until I could feel the pulse of every human heart within 100 meters of me. For a fraction of a second, I was not one person. I was a node in a network of consciousness that encompassed every soldier in the district, every Astartes in the city, every mortal on the planet. I felt their fear and their purpose and their pain, and above it all, threading through it like a current through a wire, I felt him. Not his thoughts, not his emotions, his will. The sheer, monolithic force of a mind, older than any history I knew, older than the idea of history itself, bearing down on this one world, this one day, this 1 hour, with the focused intensity of a fusion lance applied to a rail seam. And then it passed, not gone, diminished, pulled back to a level that a human brain could survive without burning out. I gasped. I was on my knees. I didn't remember falling. My nose was bleeding, a thin red trickle down my upper lip. Around me, soldiers were picking themselves up, shaking their heads, wiping blood from their noses and their ears. 2 people in 4th Squad had lost consciousness entirely and had to be dragged to cover. The fighting resumed. The war didn't pause for revelation. We advanced through the afternoon and into the evening, pushing deeper into the city, closer to the core where the Emperor had landed. The closer we got, the stronger the sensation became. Not the initial overwhelming surge, but a constant, low-level hum of presence that sat in the back of my mind like a second heartbeat. It affected everything. My senses sharpened. Colors were more vivid. Sounds were clearer. I could hear the heartbeat of the soldier next to me, could smell the ionized tang of lass fire from 2 blocks away, could feel the vibrations of distant explosions through the soles of my boots with a precision that bordered on precognition. I knew, without understanding how, that an Aetharnate fire team was setting up a heavy weapon in the building to our left, 3 floors up, 2nd window from the corner. I signaled Palaf. She looked at me, looked at the building, and called in the position. 30 seconds later, a crack grenade took out the window and the fire team with it. She didn't ask me how I'd known. The Emperor's presence did more than inspire. It sharpened us, tuned us. We were tools being optimized for output, and the awe and the desire to be worthy were just side effects of the calibration. By nightfall, we'd reached the inner ring. The fighting was heavier here. The Aetharnate had concentrated their remaining forces around the governmental core, throwing up barricades, deploying their heaviest weapons, making the Imperium pay for every block in blood and ammunition. The Luna Wolves were engaged in the thick of it, their bolter fire a constant bass rhythm, punctuated by the sharper reports of Aetharnate energy weapons. And beyond the Astartes lines, deeper in the city, there was a light. Not fire, not explosions. A golden light that moved through the streets like liquid, flowing around buildings, spilling through windows, turning the smoke and dust of the battlefield into a luminous haze that made the war look beautiful, which was obscene. The light was him. The Emperor was advancing through the city, and everywhere he walked, the darkness retreated, and the shadows bent, and the very architecture seemed to lean toward him like plants toward a sun. I saw him for the first time through the scope of Palaf's long lass, which she handed me without a word. The magnification was sufficient to resolve details at 300 meters, and through the lens, I watched the Emperor of Mankind walk through a war zone the way a man walks through his own garden. He was enormous, not Astartes enormous, which is the simple bigness of an upscaled human. This was something else. His proportions were human, but they were perfect in a way that made every other human body look like a rough draft. He wore armor of gold, ornate beyond anything the Emperor's children could aspire to. Every surface worked with symbols and designs that seemed to shift and flow as I watched. He carried a sword that blazed with a light that had nothing to do with reflection, a weapon that seemed less like a physical object and more like a contained concept, the idea of violence given edge and point. Around him walked his custodians, those golden giants I'd seen one of aboard the relentless Advance. But where he had been a single impressive figure, these were a host, dozens of them moving in perfect formation, their guardian spears sweeping the approaches with the practiced economy of warriors for whom combat was not a profession, but a fundamental state of being. They were taller than the Luna Wolves, broader. Their armor was more ornate, more layered, more ancient, and they moved with the fluidity that the Astartes lacked, a grace that spoke of centuries of individual training rather than the mass-produced excellence of the legions. But it was the Emperor I couldn't look away from, not because of the armor or the sword or the light, because of his face. Through the scope at 300 meters, through smoke and dust and the thermal distortion of a burning city, I saw his face, and it was the most human face I had ever seen. Not beautiful, though it was that. Not commanding, though it was that too. Human. Deeply, fundamentally, achingly human. Every face I'd ever looked at, every expression I'd ever read, every moment of connection I'd ever had with another member of my species was reflected in that face, distilled and concentrated and returned to me in a form that was unbearable in its completeness. I was looking at the template, the original, the face from which all other faces were derived, the human being from which all other human beings were pale, diluted copies. I lowered the scope. My hands were shaking. My eyes were wet. I hadn't blinked in what felt like minutes. "He's beautiful," I said. Pallav took her long lass back. She was crying, too, and she was the hardest person I'd ever known. "He's not beautiful," she said. "He's us. That's what hurts." The fighting didn't stop because the Emperor had arrived. If anything, it intensified. The Aetharnate, to their extraordinary credit, did not break and run. They fought harder. They knew what was coming for them. They knew they couldn't stop it, and they chose to resist anyway. I don't know if that's courage or stubbornness, or the simple refusal of a people to accept the end of everything they'd built, but it was real, and it cost them dearly. I watched the Emperor fight. I need you to understand what that means, because the word fight, applied to the Emperor of Mankind, is like applying the word rain to a tsunami. The Aetharnate had concentrated 3 battalions around a fortified position, controlling the main approach to their council chambers. 3 battalions of professional soldiers in powered armor, supported by armored vehicles and heavy weapons, dug in behind meters of reinforced composite, fighting with the desperation of people defending not just their government, but their identity as a civilization. It was a formidable position. Against mortal troops, it would have held for days. The Emperor walked toward it. He didn't charge. He didn't run. He walked at the pace of a man taking a stroll, and the custodians walked with him, and the golden light walked with him, and the sound that wasn't a sound rose to a pitch that made my vision blur and my thoughts scatter like insects before a fire. The Aetharnate fired everything they had, Energy beams, projectile weapons, rockets, grenades, every weapon in their arsenal directed at the golden figure advancing toward their lines. The beams bent, not reflected. Bent, curving away from him as if deflected by a gravity well, dissipating into the air harmlessly. The projectiles slowed and stopped, hanging in the air like frozen rain, then dropped to the ground. A rocket detonated 6 meters from his face, and the explosion broke around him like a wave around a rock, the shock wave and shrapnel and heat streaming past on either side while he walked through the center of it untouched. He reached the barricade. He raised his sword, and the fortified position, 3 battalions of soldiers, several hundred meters of reinforced composite, armored vehicles, heavy weapons emplacements, all of it ceased to exist. Not exploded, not destroyed, ceased. One moment it was there, solid and real, full of people who were alive and fighting. The next moment there was a flash of golden light so intense that I saw the bones of my own hand through my flesh, and when the afterimage faded, the position was gone. In its place was a crater, smooth-sided, perfectly circular, the edges glazed to glass by heat beyond any scale I could comprehend. Nothing remained. No bodies, no wreckage. No evidence that 3 battalions of human beings had stood there moments before. They had been unmade, reduced to component atoms and scattered by a force that treated matter as an inconvenience. Around me, soldiers cheered. The Lunar Wolves pushed forward, through the gap. The assault continued. The war went on, and I stood there in the shadow of a building that had been someone's home 2 days ago, and I tried to understand what I had just witnessed. Not a battle, not combat. An erasure. The Emperor of Mankind hadn't fought those soldiers. He had removed them from existence with the same casual precision I might use to brush dust from my sleeve. 3 battalions. Perhaps 4,000 people. Professionals, defenders. Human beings with names and families and histories, with gardens and scrolls and white composite buildings, and a civilization that had survived the long night. Gone. Not defeated. Annihilated. Reduced to nothing by a being who hadn't even slowed his pace. I didn't cheer. I should have. Everyone around me was cheering, and my silence was conspicuous, and I knew it. But I couldn't make the sound, because I'd just seen something that the official accounts and the remembrancers and the iterators would never describe honestly. I'd seen the Emperor of Mankind kill 4,000 people with less effort than I used to seal a rail joint, and the expression on his face, that perfect, human, beautiful face, hadn't changed at all. The night after the main defensive line fell was the longest of my life. Not because of the fighting, which continued in pockets throughout the city, sporadic and desperate and increasingly one-sided, because of what we were ordered to do. Compliance protocol, when the target is a Xenos world or a feral settlement or a mutant enclave, is straightforward. You kill what needs killing, destroy what needs destroying, and move on. The paperwork is minimal. The moral calculations are simple, or at least simple enough to file away in the part of your brain that handles the things you don't think about. But when the target is a human civilization, when the people you're conquering speak a language derived from the same roots as yours, and bleed the same color, and have faces that remind you of people you left behind on your own world, the protocol becomes something else. Something that requires you to do things that you will remember for the rest of your life, however long or short that turns out to be. Our orders were to secure the western residential districts. Secure in this context meant disarm, detain, and pacify the civilian population. The military resistance in our sector had collapsed after the Emperor's destruction of the main defensive line. The surviving Aetharnate soldiers, either surrendering or melting into the population. Our job was to go house by house, block by block, and ensure that no weapons, no organized resistance, and no potential threats remained. I want to tell you that it was clean. I want to tell you that we followed the rules, respected the non-combatants, treated the civilian population with the restraint and dignity that the imperial truth demanded. I want to tell you that because it would make this easier. What I can tell you is the truth, and the truth is messier. The Aethernate civilians were terrified. Of course they were. Their world had been invaded, their military shattered, their government district occupied by giants in armor who had arrived from the stars with weapons that could unmake matter. Some of them cooperated, opened their doors when we knocked, hands raised, children behind them, eyes wide with a fear that made my stomach turn because I recognized it. I'd felt it myself years ago when the ships came down on Viranthos. Some of them fought, not with military weapons, with kitchen implements, with tools, with the desperate improvised armaments of people who have nothing left to lose. An old man with a metal rod, a woman with a chemical sprayer modified to project a stream of caustic fluid, a teenager with a homemade explosive that went off too early and took his hand and most of his face. We shot them, all of them. We shot the old man and the woman, and we would have shot the teenager too if the explosion hadn't done our work for us. Because the orders said secure, and secure meant no threats, and a human being with a weapon is a threat regardless of whether the weapon is a bolter or a table leg. I killed a man on the second day of the pacification who was standing in the doorway of his home with a las pistol, a civilian model, the kind of thing you'd keep for personal protection. He wasn't aiming at anyone. He was just standing there, weapon at his side, watching us approach, his face showing something that I now recognize as dignity. He wasn't going to surrender, and he wasn't going to attack. He was going to stand in his own doorway and refuse to move, and he was going to die for it, and he knew it, and he'd made his peace with it. I shot him from 15 meters, one round, center mass. He folded and fell, and behind him in the hallway, I could see a dining table set for a meal that would never be eaten, and beyond that, a room full of books. Actual physical books, hundreds of them, shelved floor to ceiling, more books than I'd seen in my entire life. The Aetharnate were readers. They were scholars and gardeners and builders and artists, and I was killing them because they'd had the temerity to say no. And as I stood in that doorway, looking at the dead man and his books and his uneaten dinner, the gray-haired bureaucrat from Orbith Secundus surfaced in my memory, sitting behind his desk with his pen and his disappointment. And I understood that he and this man were the same person. Different worlds, different faces, same choice, same refusal, same ending. 3 hours later, I found the cellar. We were clearing a residential block on the western fringe of the district. Standard procedure: kick the door, sweep the rooms, check for weapons, tag and move. My squad was spread across the building, one fire team per floor, and I'd taken the ground level with Trevin, a replacement from the Festa 3 draft, who was thorough but slow. He was still clearing the kitchen area when I moved into the back rooms alone. I heard something beneath the floor. Not much. A shift of weight, the kind of sound that a person makes when they're trying very hard not to make any sound at all. I found the cellar access behind a storage unit, a hatch set into the floor, sealed from below. I should have called Trevin, should have called it in. Every sealed space was a potential threat, every hidden room a possible weapons cache, and the orders were clear. Report, breach, secure. I opened the hatch myself. Below, in a space barely large enough for a cargo pallet, were 5 people. A woman, 3 children, and an old man who might have been her father. They were pressed together in the dark, the children's faces buried against the woman's body, the old man's hand over the youngest child's mouth to keep her quiet. They looked up at me with the particular terror of people who have already accepted that they're dead and are simply waiting for the confirmation. The youngest child was wearing one shoe. The other foot was bare. I looked at them. They looked at me. And in the silence between us, something cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. A hairline fracture in the mechanism that had kept me functioning for years. The discipline and the distance and the professional detachment that allowed a man to do this work without losing the ability to look at himself. The seam I'd been welding over and over, the joint between what I was and what I was doing, split. I closed the hatch. I moved the storage unit back over it. I marked the building as cleared. I walked out and rejoined my squad and said nothing. 5 people hidden in the dark, invisible in the records. An act so small that it changed nothing about the compliance, nothing about the war, nothing about the fate of 6 million people, but it changed something about me, and I knew it. And I knew that in the psychic network that the Emperor's presence had created across the entire city, an act of deliberate disobedience was a crack in the surface that his mind would feel the way I'd feel a flaw in a rail seam. Through my fingertips, through the vibration, through the wrongness of a joint that didn't sit true, I didn't know what would come of it. I knew only that I'd made a choice, and that the being who had built the Imperium to function on the precise elimination of individual choices was somewhere in this city, and his awareness extended to every corner of it. It was during those same hours of pacification that I learned about Varanthos. Not from any briefing or official source, from a sergeant in the 91st Cohort, a woman from a world called Drebrand, whose unit was rotating through our sector for resupply. We shared a ration break in the shadow of a collapsed school, and she asked where I was from, and I told her, and her face changed. Her cohort had been part of the fleet that brought Varanthos into compliance. She'd been there, boots on the ground, as she put it, clearing the upper-level manufactoria while the Astartes handled the threshold defenses. 9 days, I said. She looked at me oddly. 9 days was the official record, she told me. The surface fighting lasted 9 days, but the sub-levels held out longer. Workers had barricaded the access shafts, used mining charges and freight haulers as improvised weapons. It took weeks to flush them out. She'd been posted at Shaft 16 during the final operations and said the smoke that came up from the sub-levels had smelled like burning metal and something else, something that no one talked about afterward. The ventilation shafts were sealed. The tunnels were sealed. Whatever happened below, she said, stayed below. I asked how many died. She didn't know. Thousands, she guessed. Maybe more. Nobody was counting by the end. I asked about the Shaft 12 district, my district, the place where I'd lived and worked and eaten and slept for 23 years. She said she didn't know the specifics, but the sub-level casualties had been concentrated in the Eastern Freight Network, which was where Shaft 12 was located. I thanked her for the information. She moved on. I sat in the shadow of the collapsed school and held the black pebble from Kesavar and the fragment of quartz from Thren Septimus. And I thought about my mother, who had worked in the Shaft 12 refectory, and my sister, who had been an apprentice rail sealer 2 levels below me, and the 40 workers I'd sheltered with in the freight tunnel during the compliance, and I realized that I didn't know which of them were alive. I'd never checked. I'd been shipped off-world so quickly, processed so efficiently, that I'd never had the chance or the thought to ask what happened to the people I'd left behind. I'd assumed they were fine. The compliance had been quick. 9 days. Clean. Professional. 9 days was a lie. And the people who told it to me were the same people who told me the Aetharnate needed to be liberated. The deeper we pushed into the residential districts, the worse it got. Not the fighting, which was tapering off as resistance crumbled. The seeing. Because now we were inside the Aethernate Concordance, inside its homes and its schools and its hospitals and its libraries, and what we found there was a civilization that put the Imperium to shame. They had public gardens on every block, not the ornamental, controlled green spaces that I'd seen on Imperial worlds, carefully maintained by servitors and monitored by administratum officials. Wild gardens. Gardens where things grew the way they wanted to grow, where the design was organic and evolving, where children played among trees that had been growing for centuries. They had schools where the curriculum included art and music and philosophy alongside the practical sciences. I found one in a building we'd been ordered to clear, where the walls of every classroom were covered in murals painted by the students, scenes of their world and their history, and their dreams for the future, all rendered in colors so vivid they seemed to glow. The murals were damaged by our entry, boot prints on the lower panels, a door kicked open hard enough to crack the plaster. On one of the desks, a child's drawing had been left behind, half-finished, a wax stylus still resting in the fold of the paper where a small hand had set it down and never come back. They had a medical system that treated every citizen free of cost, using techniques and technologies that our Medicae would have recognized as superior to anything in the Imperial Army's field kits. Pala found a hospital where the surgical suites were still operational, their automated systems running through sterilization cycles in the absence of staff, preparing for patients who would never arrive. The operating tables were designed for comfort. The rooms had windows. There were plants on the windowsills. I'd spent 5 years in the Imperial Army, serving a civilization that ground its people into paste for the sake of efficiency, where the concept of comfort was considered a weakness, and the idea of growing a plant for pleasure was an absurdity. And now I was standing in the ruins of a society that had achieved everything the Imperium claimed to aspire to, a unified, prosperous, technologically advanced human civilization, and I was helping to destroy it because the Emperor wanted something it had. On the 3rd day of pacification, I came as close as I ever would to understanding what it was all for. We were detailed to secure a district that the Aethernate called the Athenaeum Quarter. It was in the northeastern section of Luminar, a complex of interconnected buildings surrounding a structure that defied easy description. It wasn't a temple, though it had the scale of one. It wasn't a fortress, though it was heavily constructed. It was a vault, a repository, a building designed, from the ground up, to preserve something. Its walls were 3 meters thick, made from a material that our field analysts identified as an alloy of adamantium and something else, something they didn't recognize. Its doors were sealed with mechanisms that combined physical locks with some kind of energy barrier, and when the custodians arrived to take control of the site, we were pulled back to the outer cordon and told in no uncertain terms that what lay inside was not our concern, that we had not seen it, that we would not speak of it. We hadn't seen much. A doorway glimpsed through the breached outer wall before the Golden Guardians sealed the approach. An archway of pale material that didn't catch the light the way stone should. And beyond it, for just a moment, a darkness that wasn't darkness, a depth that the eye slid off, as if the space inside the arch went somewhere the rest of the room did not. I didn't understand what I was looking at. None of us did. The engineering crews who'd made the initial breach spoke in whispers before the custodians shut them out, using words that meant nothing to me. A stable breach, a controlled aperture. The technicians were afraid, which told me more than their jargon did. But whatever it was, the custodians wanted it buried in silence, and men who value their lives learn not to ask questions that golden giants have already answered with a look. Here is what I understood, though no one told me directly, though I pieced it together only later and never said it aloud. The Emperor hadn't come to Aetharna for compliance. He hadn't come for unity or the imperial truth, or the expansion of human dominion, or any of the reasons the iterators recited like prayers. He had come for whatever waited in that vault. Some fragment of the ancient past that the Aethernate had spent centuries guarding, some piece of a design too vast and too secret for a corporal to comprehend. And the Emperor, whose mind could reach across the stars, whose sight touched things no mortal instrument could find, had known it was here. That was why the iterators had come with their smiles and their offers. Not because Aetharna was one more world among thousands, but because it sat on top of something he needed, and he had sent the soft approach first because the soft approach was cheaper. When it failed, he sent everything else. The entire compliance action, the fleet, the Astartes, the army, the orbital bombardment, the 4,000 people unmade by a thought, the man I'd shot in his own doorway, the bare foot of a child hidden in a cellar, all of it was for this one thing. And the terrible part, the part I've never been able to set down, is that the Aethernate never knew. They didn't refuse because they understood what was buried beneath their city and what it would cost them. They refused because they were free, and they wished to stay free, and they had no way of knowing that the thing their ancestors had guarded for centuries had already marked them for death the moment the Emperor turned his attention their way. They died defending their independence. They never learned that their independence was never the point. Not that they were fools. They had looked at the Imperium and seen a power that did not take no for an answer, and they had chosen to die on their feet rather than surrender their freedom to it. That much they understood. That much was true and clear-eyed and brave. They simply never knew that their courage was beside the point, that the choice they thought they were making, submission or resistance, had never been offered to them in good faith. There was only ever one outcome. They had been dead from the moment the Emperor decided he wanted what was theirs, and the Emperor had killed them for it. I didn't share these thoughts with anyone. I didn't voice them. I didn't write them down. I carried them inside me like a piece of shrapnel too close to a vital organ to be removed, and I went on doing my job because the job was all I had. Pallav knew. I could see it in her face, in the way she looked at the Aethernate buildings and the Aethernate dead, and the empty places where the children had been. She knew, and she said nothing, because what was there to say? We were soldiers. We had orders. And the Emperor of mankind, the most powerful being in the galaxy, had wanted something these people had. The pacification of Luminar took 6 days. By the end, the city was quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet the way a body is quiet after the life has left it. The fires had mostly burned out, leaving blackened shells where there had been homes. The gardens were ash. The libraries were rubble. The hospital windows were dark. 6 million people had lived in this city. I don't know how many were dead. Thousands, certainly. Perhaps tens of thousands. The rest had been rounded up, processed, assigned to detention camps on the outskirts where administratum officials were already beginning the work of integration, which meant stripping away everything that had made them Aetharnate and replacing it with everything that made them Imperial. Their names would change, their laws would change. Their children would be taught the imperial truth, and the history of their world would be revised to show that the compliance had been necessary, that the concordance had been corrupt or misguided or tainted by Xenos influence, that the Emperor had come not to take, but to save. I collected a fragment of white composite from the ruins of the man's house, the man I'd shot. I don't know why I chose that particular piece. It was the size of my thumbnail, smooth on one side, rough on the other where it had broken. I put it in my pouch with the black pebble and the quartz and the other fragments of other worlds, and it sat there like an accusation, like a debt that I didn't know how to pay. The Emperor remained on Aetharna for 11 days after the city fell. 11 days during which his technicians and his custodians, and whatever other specialists he employed, worked inside the sealed Athenaeum, doing things that no one outside was permitted to see or know. The rest of us waited. The army garrisoned the city. The Astartes secured the perimeter. The fleet maintained orbital superiority. And the Emperor was inside that vault, doing whatever it was he'd come here to do, while 6 million people's lives lay in ruins around him. During those 11 days, something happened that I didn't expect. An encounter that redirected the entire course of my life, though I didn't understand it at the time. I was on perimeter duty at the Athenaeum. Night shift, walking a circuit of the outer cordon, Las gun across my chest, breath fogging in the cool air. Aetharna's nights were cold, a clean, biting cold that tasted of snow and pine sap. Nothing like the recycled warmth of Viranthos. The sky was clear for the first time since the bombardment, and I could see stars. Real stars, not the filtered, dimmed points of light visible through the pollution haze of my homeworld. For a long, quiet moment, I stood there and looked up and felt something I hadn't felt since before the compliance. Something small and fragile and deeply, deliberately forgotten. Homesickness. Not for Viranthos. For what Viranthos should have been. For what a human world should be. For gardens and libraries and dining tables set for meals and children who were allowed to grow up. For a civilization that treated its people as people and not as components. And that was when the custodian spoke to me. I hadn't heard him approach. Custodians move like that, silent as a held breath. He was suddenly beside me, a head and a half taller, his guardian spear held loosely in one hand, his golden helm under his other arm. I recognized his face immediately, severe and sharp, the face of a weapon given flesh. The same custodian I'd glimpsed through the viewport of the officer's shuttle weeks ago when the fleet was still assembling. He looked down at me with the same predator's assessment of relevance, and I understood that he had been watching for longer than I'd known. You were on the line when he broke the defensive position. It wasn't a question. I confirmed that I was. You didn't cheer? I didn't respond to that. And in the Western residential block, he continued, his voice as flat and precise as a targeting solution, you marked a building as cleared. But it wasn't clear, was it? The stars above Aetharna were very bright. The air smelled of pine sap and ash and the distant chemical residue of a civilization being dissolved. I felt the ground beneath my boots, the weight of my Las gun, the rapid, useless hammering of my heart. You found them. You closed the hatch. You lied in your report. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. He knew. The Emperor knew. The psychic network that had sharpened my senses and heightened my awareness had also, apparently, transmitted my defiance with the same clarity it transmitted my combat effectiveness. Every crack is visible in a perfect surface. He studied me for a moment. Then his voice dropped, and the words he spoke carved themselves into my memory like an inscription on a bulkhead. He noticed, not the silence, not the building. He noticed the seam that won't hold. He wants to see it. Then he put his helm back on and walked away into the darkness, his golden armor catching the starlight, and I was alone again with my last gun and my duty and the cold, spreading understanding that the Emperor of mankind hadn't just observed my disobedience, he'd diagnosed it, the way I'd diagnose a rail joint that was carrying too much stress. not with anger, not with judgment, with the clinical interest of a craftsman who has found a flaw in a component and wants to assess whether it can be repaired. I didn't sleep that night. I completed my perimeter circuit with the mechanical precision of a man whose body has been trained to function independently of his mind. And when my shift ended, I sat on my cot in the barracks section we'd established in a cleared residential block and stared at the wall. He noticed. He wants to see it. The words sat in my chest like swallowed metal. 2 days passed, 2 days of routine garrison duty during which I functioned normally while inside me a knot of anticipation tightened steadily, like a bolt being turned in its thread, clicking closer and closer to the point where it would either seat properly or strip. On the 3rd day, the summons came. It arrived through the chain of command with the efficiency of a virus. A custodian approached our battalion commander. The battalion commander summoned Captain Kest. Captain Kest summoned Palav. Palav found me in the mess section, eating a ration bar that claimed to be beef stew and tasted like everything else. She sat down across from me and put her hands flat on the table and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. It was the expression of someone who has been given information that they can't process and can't refuse. "You've been called," she said. I asked where. She told me. The Athenaeum. I want to describe the walk from our barracks to the Athenaeum, because every step of it is burned into my memory with the vividness of a branding iron. Through the quiet streets of conquered Luminar, past the ruins of homes I'd helped to empty, past the gardens turned to ash, past the barricades we'd erected, and the checkpoints we'd manned and the detention centers where the Aetharnate population waited in neat numbered rows for their futures to be decided by bureaucrats with quills. 2 kilometers of devastation, walked in the company of a single custodian who said nothing, and whose golden armor reflected the gray sky like a mirror reflecting something better. At the entrance to the Athenaeum, I was stopped, searched, disarmed. My last gun was taken, my sidearm, my combat knife, the pouch of stones and fragments, my collection from a dozen worlds, was examined and returned to me with an indifference that suggested the custodians had already assessed it as harmless. 2 days earlier, they had turned the whole garrison away from this place at spear point, had made it clear that to see inside was to forfeit your life. Now they were leading me through it. A corporal, a rail sealer. The wrongness of that, the sheer impossibility of it, was louder than any words could have been. I was being taken somewhere no mortal of my rank had any business going, and only one authority in the galaxy could have overruled the silence the custodians had built around this vault. I was led through corridors that smelled of stone dust and machine oil, and something else, something that tingled at the edges of perception, a scent that wasn't a scent, an atmospheric presence that grew stronger with every step until the air itself seemed to vibrate with contained energy. The vault was larger than I'd expected. The Aetharnate had carved it deep into the bedrock beneath their city, a cathedral-sized chamber with walls of that adamantium alloy, every surface inscribed with patterns that I recognized with a jolt of something between recognition and revulsion, as being not of human origin. The patterns were too fluid, too organic, too alien. They had the look of things that had grown rather than been made, and they pulsed with a faint luminescence that suggested they were not merely decorative. At the center of the chamber, surrounded by equipment I couldn't begin to identify, attended by robed technicians and armored custodians and other figures whose function I could only guess at, stood the arch, material that might have been bone and might have been stone and might have been something else entirely, perhaps 10 meters tall, its interior filled not with passage but with a dull, lightless dark, a surface like standing water gone black and still. It was dormant, Whatever it had once been, whatever it might yet become, it was closed now, inert, a door that had forgotten how to open. And around it the Emperor's servants worked with the patient intensity of men trying to remember a language that no living tongue had spoken in 10,000 years. And standing before the arch, his back to me, was the Emperor. The custodian who had escorted me stopped. I stopped. The chamber was enormous, and there were dozens of people in it, technicians and guards and specialists, but the space felt empty except for him. Everything else, every other person, every piece of equipment, every surface and shadow and source of light existed in his periphery. He was the center, the only center, the point around which everything else arranged itself, not by choice but by the fundamental physics of his presence. He turned. I don't know how to describe what happened when the Emperor of Mankind looked at me. The word looked is inadequate. He turned, and his gaze found me, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, I was unmade. Not destroyed, unmade. Every layer of identity that I'd constructed over 28 years of life, every memory, every opinion, every fear and desire and habit and preference, every moment of experience that had accumulated into the thing I called myself, was stripped away in an instant, peeled back like the layers of a cable, and what was left underneath was something raw and fundamental and older than language. The core, the basic template of a human being, before culture and environment and choice had shaped it into a specific person. I was that. I was reduced to that. And in that state of absolute vulnerability, the Emperor of Mankind spoke to me. Not with words, not with language, with something that existed before words, a form of communication so direct and so total that it bypassed every filter and defense that a conscious mind possesses and poured itself into the empty space where Lenko Osse had been. I was shown things. The first thing I was shown was the warp. Not the warp as I knew it, the unpleasant medium through which ships traveled, the source of nightmares and nausea, and the occasional horror story told by voidsmen in mess halls. The real warp, the Imperium, the dimension of pure psychic energy that existed alongside material reality, mirroring it, feeding on it, shaped by every thought and emotion that every sentient being in the galaxy had ever produced. I saw it, and I understood in that moment that the warp was alive. Not in the way that a man is alive, or a beast, or a plant. Alive in a way that made biological life look like a rough sketch. The warp was an ocean of consciousness, vast and deep and churning with currents of emotion made manifest, and within that ocean there were things, intelligences, entities of staggering power and malevolent will, beings that had been formed from the accumulated nightmares and desires and agonies of 1,000,000 species over 1,000,000 years. And they were hungry. They were always hungry. They fed on mortal emotions, on fear and rage and desire and despair. And they wanted more. They wanted in. I was shown what would happen if they got in. Not in abstract terms, not in the language of threat and consequence that the iterators used when they spoke of Xenos dangers and the necessity of human unity. I was shown it directly, poured into my consciousness like molten metal into a mold. I saw worlds burning, not with physical fire, but with psychic conflagration, reality itself melting and reforming into landscapes of madness and suffering. I saw human beings twisted into shapes that served no purpose except to express the aesthetic preferences of things that had never been human. I saw cities where the laws of physics obeyed the whims of laughing gods, where gravity worked sideways and time ran in loops, and the screaming never stopped because the people doing the screaming couldn't die. I saw the end of everything. Not darkness, not oblivion. Something worse. An eternity of suffering, of existence without meaning, of consciousness without escape, stretching forward into a future that would never end because time itself had been broken. And I understood. In that moment, with the absolute clarity that comes from having truth transmitted directly into the substrate of your mind, I understood why the Emperor did what he did, why the Aetharnate had to be conquered, why what they guarded had to be taken, why every human world had to be unified, every resistance crushed, every alternative extinguished. Because the alternative was that. The laughing gods, the ocean of madness, the end of everything that the word human had ever meant, forever. The Aetharnate, with their gardens and their libraries and their hidden children, had been standing on the edge of an abyss they couldn't see. The Emperor could see it. He'd been able to see it for 40,000 years. And everything he'd built, every army he'd raised, every compliance he'd ordered, every life he'd taken, was a wall between humanity and that abyss. Not a perfect wall, not a gentle wall. A wall built from necessity and maintained by force, and mortared with the blood of people who deserved better. But a wall. The only wall. This understanding was the first thing the Emperor gave me. It was vast and terrible, and it recontextualized everything I'd experienced since the moment the ships descended on Veranthos. Every death, every ruined garden, every burning library. All of it was the cost of the wall. The second thing he gave me was peace. And this is where I need to be honest with you, because honesty is the only currency I have left, and because what I'm about to describe is the worst thing that has ever happened to me. The peace came in like a tide, slowly at first, then all at once. I felt my horror at what I'd done on Aetharna recede, not disappear, but recede, pulling back from the forefront of my consciousness, like water draining from a basin. I felt my grief for the Aetharnate, for their civilization, for the man I'd shot in his doorway, and the child with the bare foot and the murals on the classroom walls fade from a sharp, cutting pain into a dull, distant ache. I felt my doubt about the Great Crusade, about the Emperor, about the purpose and the cost and the morality of everything I'd been part of, settle and still, like sediment sinking to the bottom of a glass of water, leaving the surface clear. And I felt it happening. That's the part that matters. I wasn't unconscious. I wasn't unaware. I felt each doubt as it was taken, felt each question as it was answered, felt each objection as it was addressed, not with argument, but with adjustment. The Emperor wasn't persuading me. He was calibrating me, reaching into the machinery of my mind and turning the dials until the readings came out right, until the horror was manageable, until the grief was bearable, until the doubt was resolved into acceptance. I knew what was happening. I could feel the shape of the intervention, the precision of it, the surgical delicacy with which specific neural pathways were being reinforced and others dampened. It wasn't crude. It wasn't the obliterating force he'd used on the Aetharnate defensive line. It was the work of a craftsman, fine and meticulous, the kind of work I might do on a delicate rail junction, where the tolerances were measured in fractions of a millimeter. He was fixing me, repairing the damage that the truth had done, restoring me to operational capacity. And the worst part, the part that I have never been able to speak of without tasting bile, is that it felt good. It felt like putting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten what it was like to stand straight. It felt like warmth after cold, like water after thirst, like the first breath after near drowning. Relief. Profound, total, overwhelming relief. The horror was still there, but it didn't hurt anymore. The grief was still there, but it was bearable now. The doubt was still there, but it had been answered. not by logic or evidence, but by the direct application of the most powerful psychic mind in the galaxy. And the answer it had provided was not, "No, your doubts are wrong," but rather, "Yes, everything you fear is true, and it doesn't matter." That was the core of the Emperor's gift. Not ignorance, not blindness, not the erasure of knowledge or the suppression of memory. He left me everything I'd seen and felt and understood. The Aetharnate, the vault and what it held, the truth about the compliance, the warp and its horrors. He left me all of it. And then he made it so that none of it could break me. And the heaviest of what he left me was the truth about the warp itself, because that truth was the one thing the Imperium killed to keep buried. The iterators preached to every world we took that there were no gods and no demons, that the dark held nothing but ignorance and old superstition. That was the creed we enforced at gunpoint. That was the imperial truth, and to say otherwise, to claim the gods were real, was the kind of heresy that saw men shot and worlds burned from orbit. And the being who had authored that creed had just reached into my skull and shown me it was a lie. The gods were real. They were hungry. They were waiting. He had made a rail sealer from Viranthos into a keeper of the single secret. His entire order existed to bury, and he had done it without hesitation, handed the forbidden thing to a nobody and turned his back, because he had first made certain that I could never use it, never carry it to anyone who mattered, and never be believed if I tried. A sealed vessel is a safe one. That was the lesson. Not for me. About me. I stood in that vault in the presence of the Emperor of mankind, with tears running down my face and my hands shaking, and I thought about the family in the cellar, the woman, the children, the old man, the one barefoot. I'd risked everything for them, disobeyed a direct order, lied in an official report, committed an act of moral defiance that I'd believed meant something, and now I could feel that defiance being soldered shut. The crack I'd made by choosing mercy was being filled, the seam resealed, the joint made smooth and load-bearing again. The Emperor was doing to my mind what I'd spent years doing to rail joints, running the lance along the flaw, fusing it closed, making it strong enough to carry what needed carrying. And I felt grateful, deep, genuine, overwhelming gratitude, because the pain was gone, and the doubt was gone, and the horror was gone, and in their place was a clarity so clean it felt like sunlight on water. I knew with every cell and every synapse and every fiber of my being that this was wrong. That gratitude for psychic violation is not gratitude. That the relief I felt was not mine. It had been installed, placed there by an intelligence that viewed my suffering as a malfunction, and my doubt as a defect, and my mercy in that cellar as a crack in a component that needed to hold. The Emperor looked at me. His face had not changed, that perfect human beautiful face. And in his eyes, which were the color of old gold and deep as the warp itself, I saw nothing. No cruelty, no kindness, no satisfaction in the work he'd done. Nothing. Just awareness. The vast, cold, inhuman awareness of a being that had been alive for 40,000 years and had long ago stopped seeing individual human beings as anything other than elements in a calculation so vast that no mortal mind could comprehend its scope. He didn't love me. He didn't hate me. He didn't even pity me. He needed me to function. So he had fixed me, the same way I might fix a rail joint, with skill and precision and no emotional investment whatsoever. I understood something else too in the moments after, as the clarity settled over me like fresh snow. I hadn't been summoned because I mattered. I'd been summoned because I was a problem worth solving once, so that it could be solved 1,000 times after. A soldier who saw the truth of the compliance and cracked under it was a flaw in the design, and the Emperor did not tolerate flaws he could repair. He had reached into me not out of interest in Lenko Osse, but to learn the shape of the repair itself, to test whether a mind broken by knowledge could be made whole and useful again without erasing what it knew. I was a prototype, a proof, and it had worked, which meant it would be done again to others in the years to come whenever a component threatened to fail. I was not the exception to the Great Crusade's cruelty. I was its refinement. I was escorted out of the Athenaeum by the same custodian who had brought me in. He said nothing. He didn't need to. I walked back through the ruined streets of Luminar, past the ashes of gardens, and the wreckage of libraries and the quiet detention centers, and I felt fine. Better than fine. I felt clear, focused, ready to do my job. The fragment of white composite in my pouch didn't feel like an accusation anymore. It felt like a souvenir, and I knew with the part of me that the Emperor hadn't touched because he hadn't needed to, because it wasn't a threat to my functionality, that I had just been shown the true nature of the being I served. Not a god, not a savior, not a father, a mechanic. The greatest, most powerful, most terrifyingly precise mechanic in the history of the species, maintaining a machine called humanity, replacing broken parts, adjusting tolerances, discarding what couldn't be fixed. His love for humanity was real. I'd felt it during the vision, a vast, genuine, absolute love for the species as a whole, for its potential, for its future, for what it could become if it survived the abyss. But his love for individual human beings, for the small, specific, irreplaceable persons that humanity was actually composed of, for the rail sealer from Viranthos, and the man with the las pistol and the barefoot child I'd hidden in the dark. That love did not exist, could not exist, because to love the individual is to hesitate before sacrificing it, and the Emperor could not afford to hesitate, not once, not ever. The wall had to be built, and walls are made of bricks, and no one mourns a brick. Pallav was waiting for me when I got back to the barracks. She was sitting on my cot, which she never did, with her hands flat on her knees, which she always did when she was preparing for something she expected to be bad. She looked at my face, and I watched her expression shift through several states in rapid succession. Relief that I was alive, confusion at whatever she saw in my eyes, and then something else, something that settled over her features like frost forming on metal. She recognized it. She'd spent 20 years working around machines, and she knew what a recalibrated instrument looked like. She asked what happened. I told her I'd been given a commendation for conduct during the assault, a personal note of recognition from the Emperor's staff. Nothing extraordinary. She looked at me the way you look at a rail joint that's been resealed over a flaw you know is still there. She didn't believe me, but she nodded and she didn't press, and over the days that followed she began to drink, and I understood that she was mourning someone who was still alive, and that the someone was me. The fleet departed Aetharna 16 days after the initial assault. The Emperor and his custodians withdrew to the Bucephalus with whatever they'd extracted from the gateway vault, and the golden ship translated into the warp and was gone, taking with it that low-frequency hum that had sat in the back of every human brain on the planet since his arrival. Its departure was like a sudden silence after years of background noise, a deafening absence that left soldiers blinking and confused and vaguely empty, as if something essential had been removed from the air itself. The 831st Expeditionary Fleet resumed its duties. New orders, new target systems, new compliance actions. The machinery of conquest turned, and we turned with it, components in a mechanism that didn't stop to mourn or question or remember. Aetharna became a name in a file, a a compliance action in the records, one of thousands, a successful operation, casualties within acceptable parameters, strategic objectives achieved. I served on. That's the part that needs to be understood, because it's the part that carries the weight of everything that came before. I served on, and I was good at it, better than I'd been before. Not because the Emperor's intervention had made me more skilled or more capable. My hands were the same hands. My eyes were the same eyes. The improvement was in the absence of friction. Before Aetharna, there had been a resistance inside me, a drag, the weight of doubt and moral uncertainty slowing every decision, adding a fraction of a second of hesitation to every trigger pull. After Aetharna, the resistance was gone. I operated smoothly, cleanly, without the inefficiency of conscience. Palav saw it. Of course she did. She'd known me for 5 years, worked beside me, slept 3 cots away, watched me grow from a frightened conscript into a functional soldier. She knew every tell I had, every shift of weight and flicker of expression that signaled what was happening inside me. And she watched that interior landscape go flat, watched the creases smooth out, watched the hesitation vanish from my trigger finger and the questions vanish from my eyes, and the man she knew reassembled into something that looked identical but operated differently, the way a rail joint looks the same after welding but carries a different load. She never said what she thought, not directly, but she started drinking. Not the casual, off-duty drinking that every soldier does, the numb-the-edges drinking that keeps you functional between deployments. This was different. This was the drinking of a person trying to fill a space that keeps getting larger. She'd come back from patrols on the worlds after Aetharna, worlds where we pacified and secured and complied, and she'd sit on her cot with a flask of whatever rotgut the supply chain had provided, and she'd drink until her hands stopped shaking. And her hands shook more with each deployment because she was carrying it. All of it. The weight I'd put down in the Athenaeum vault, the horror and the guilt and the doubt, she was carrying double, her share and mine, because someone in the squad had to feel it, and it wasn't going to be me anymore. I noticed over the years that followed that I wasn't the only one who'd been fixed. It happened rarely and never openly. A soldier summoned, gone for a few hours, returned the same day. The doubt gone. The questions stopped. Functional again. Operational. Fixed. I saw it happen to a lieutenant who'd stopped eating after a civilian pacification. I saw it happen to a sniper who'd started missing shots she could have made asleep. Each time the same pattern. The machine maintained. Palav was offered the same. After the compliance of Greth Major, 2 years after Aetharna, when her drinking had become visible enough to affect her performance evaluations. A robed figure approached her, someone attached to the fleet's command staff whose exact function nobody could name, whose eyes had the flat calm of a person who had looked inside too many minds. The offer was implicit, delivered in the language of duty and service, and the Emperor's gratitude. Palav understood what was being offered. She'd watched it work on me. She refused. I was standing 10 meters away when she said it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a speech. She said no, and the robed figure looked at her the way you'd look at a machine part that's been offered oil and chosen rust, and walked away. And that was the end of it. The Emperor's maintenance protocol was not mandatory. It was offered, not imposed, which meant that Palav's suffering was, from the Imperium's perspective, voluntary. She lasted another 18 months. 18 months of carrying the full, unmodified weight of what the Great Crusade required of the people who fought it. She got slower, less precise. The boiler-tender steadiness that had kept our squad alive for years developed cracks that widened with each deployment. On Tessrin 4, during a routine clearing operation against a Xenos species that used chemical weapons, she was 2 seconds too slow on a withdrawal order. 2 seconds. The margin between the woman who told me to stay clear of the machinery and the woman who couldn't move fast enough to get out of its way. The chemical agent hit her left side. She had time to look down at her hand. She had time to look at me. And in her eyes, in that last half second before the pain took her, I saw something that I will carry until I die, even though the Emperor made sure it wouldn't hurt. I saw relief, the same engineered, artificial, installed relief that I'd felt in the vault. But hers was real, hers was earned. The relief of a woman who had refused to let a god fix her and had accepted the natural human consequence of staying broken in a galaxy that ground broken things to dust. I took her squad. I led it until the day they mustered me out. I trained replacements when the old hands died. I conducted patrols and secured positions and shot people who were designated as enemies by powers that operated above the level where my rank gave me visibility. The Emperor didn't do it himself every time, but the technique was his, the method was his, and the practitioners, custodians, or court psychers, or agents of the sigillite operated under his authority and with his precision, a maintenance protocol, a standard procedure for keeping the human components of the war machine within acceptable tolerances. I didn't fight it. Pahlav fought it. Pahlav, who refused the fixing, who carried the full weight, who chose rust over oil and paid for that choice with her life on Tessrin 4. She was the hero of this story, not me. I accepted what was done to me because the Emperor had shown me the alternative, and the alternative was worse. The wall had to be built. The bricks had to hold. I served the Great Crusade for another 5 years after Aetharna. 11 years total, from the day I was drafted on Viranthos to the day I finally put down my last gun for the last time. I fought on 31 worlds. I killed more people than I could count, some of them human, some of them Xenos, all of them designated as obstacles to the Imperium's expansion. I was wounded 9 times, burned twice, partially deafened in my left ear by a close proximity detonation, and once, during a boarding action against a Xenos vessel in the Scarith Nebula, I spent 14 hours floating in the void in a damaged void suit, breathing my own recycled exhalations, waiting for extraction that I wasn't sure was coming. I survived all of it, not through luck, through the cold, efficient clarity of a mind that had been optimized for survival by the most powerful being in the galaxy. I was mustered out at the age of 34. Medical discharge. The accumulated damage to my body, the burns and the fractures and the shrapnel still lodged in 3 places the medici couldn't safely reach, had degraded my combat effectiveness below the threshold that the Exertus Imperialis considered acceptable. I was no longer an asset. I was a liability, a component that had worn past its useful life. So I was retired, granted a veteran settlement allocation on one of the compliant worlds the administration was seeding with Imperial loyalists, and a commendation for distinguished service that nobody would ever read. Discharged soldiers didn't get much say in where they were sent, but we could file a preference, and the clerks honored it when it cost them nothing. And a stable, pacified, recently integrated world with a standing garrison and room for more loyal bodies was exactly the kind of place they were happy to send a broken corporal to see out his years. I chose Aetharna. I know. Perhaps it was the fragment of white composite in my pouch, still smooth on one side, rough on the other. Perhaps it was the memory of the gardens. Or perhaps it was because Aetharna was the last place where I'd been fully human. Before the vault, before the fixing, The last place where I'd felt horror and grief and doubt and all the other beautiful, terrible, essential things that make a person and not a component. I live here now, in a settlement built on the outskirts of what used to be Luminar. The city has been rebuilt, mostly. Different. Imperial architecture, Imperial infrastructure, Imperial administration. But the ground is the same, and the air is the same, and on certain nights when the wind comes from the north, it still smells of pine sap and cold stone. The Aetharna who survived the compliance have been integrated. Their children speak Low Gothic and learn the Imperial truth, and will never know what the concordance was. The Athenaeum was sealed after the Emperor's departure, the whole quarter cordoned and placed under a silence so absolute that even the garrison commanders pretend it isn't there. Whatever he took from it, whatever he learned, is locked behind doors that no authority on the planet has clearance to open. I tend a garden, a small one behind the hab unit they assigned me. I grow things in it, vegetables mostly, but also flowers. Aethernate flowers from seeds I found in the ruins. They have no practical value. They serve no industrial purpose. They are beautiful, and I grow them because I can, and because a man I killed once grew things like them in a garden outside his front door. The fragment of white composite sits on my windowsill. I look at it every morning. I feel nothing when I do. And that absence of feeling, that smooth, clean, engineered absence, is the Emperor's gift. The gift of a god who is not a god, to a soldier who is no longer entirely a man. I know what you want me to say. You want me to say I was angry. You want me to say I was broken by it, or that I healed, or that I found redemption, or that I resisted. You want a moral, a lesson. A conclusion that makes the story mean something. Here's what the story means. The Emperor of mankind loves humanity the way a forge master loves iron. He heats it, he hammers it, he folds it and tempers it and quenches it and grinds it into the shape he needs. And if a piece cracks during the process, he doesn't mourn it. He welds it shut and keeps hammering. Because the sword has to be made, because the night is coming, and the night has teeth, and the only thing standing between those teeth and every man, woman, and child in the galaxy is the blade he's forging from the body and soul of the species. I was there. I fought beside him. I saw his face and heard his silence and felt his hand inside my mind. And I am telling you, with the absolute certainty of someone who has stood in the presence of the master of mankind and lived, that he will save us, every single one of us, whether we want to be saved or not.